So welcome everybody to this session with the title Language as the Bedrock of Social Cohesion. This session is hosted by the Club Alpbach Tirol, which is an Austrian club affiliated with the European Forum Alpbach. Right off the bat, language matters. As you probably heard in Ruth's video from yesterday on Instagram, language matters on a very general level, like without language, we couldn't even be holding this session in the first place. But language also matters on a more sophisticated level and on various other levels. For example, it's closely connected to our sense of identity, our sense of belonging, the way we think of and perceive the world. Language is not just a tool, it's something that carries meaning with it and that is so powerful in this regard. And that's what this session will be about today. My name is Jenny. I am an executive board member of the Club Alpbach Tirol. I'll have the honor of hosting this event. And in the background is Ben. He's also an executive board member, and he's behind the Tyrol Austria EFA name on the chat. Just if you're wondering, he'll keep track of the chat and support me. But of course, what's way more important than Ben and I is our speaker here today, and that's Professor Wodak. Thank you so much for being here. If I may, I'll just quickly introduce Professor Wodak. She's an applied linguist, a sociolinguist, and a discourse analyst. She's a professor of applied linguistics at the University of Vienna and an emeritus distinguished professor of discourse studies at Lancaster University in the United Kingdom. She's a member of the British Academy of Social Sciences and of the Academia Europaea, difficult to pronounce. She holds honorary doctorates, for example, at Warwick University in the United Kingdom and also at Örebro University in Sweden. She has been part of numerous research projects and she has received multiple awards. Like, I am just in awe. One of the awards would be in 1996. She was the first woman to receive the Wittgenstein-Preis, which is the most highly endowed science award of Austria. And in 2018, she received the Life Achievement Award of the Austrian Ministry for Women's Affairs. She's written over 400 articles and numerous books. For example, this one, if I may, because I read it and I adored it. It's such an important book on political discourse and language. And it will be published this fall in a new edition, because this one was published in 2015, and so much has happened in the last 5 years in the regard of politics and media, so there will be a new edition of this book. Her research focus lies on critical discourse analysis, populism, specifically right-wing populism, racism, identity politics, and anti-Semitism. So thank you again so much for being here today, Ruth.
Hello.
And just a quick information on the structure of this session. We'll start off with some general topics, like what is the power of language, what is discourse analysis, so that we have some basis, some fundament, if you want, sticking with the topic of the forum, to work with. And then we'll try and tackle some of the big topics of the last years and of 2020. If you have any input or questions, feel free to post that on the chat. Ben will forward them to me. And before we dive into it, I actually found out that the Forum Alpbach Network is hosting the 24-hour reading this year again, of course, digitally. And they read from Orwell's 1984, which you also quote in your book, and which is so fitting for this year and for language. So before my first question, I would just like to read this quote because it's just so incredibly, fitting. As you may or may not know, in 1984, the government tries to develop a new language in order to, you'll see, in order to what? The language is called Newspeak. Don't you see that the whole aim of Newspeak is to narrow the range of thought? In the end, we shall make thought crime literally impossible because there will be no words in which to express it. Every concept that can ever be needed will be expressed in exactly one word, with its meaning rigidly defined and all its subsidiary meanings rubbed out and forgotten. Every year, fewer and fewer words, and the range of consciousness always a little smaller. And with that, Ruth, my big question for you would be, what is the power of language and how can it be used as a political tool?
Well, with language, we actually construct or co-construct our reality and can also change our realities. And obviously, language is not just words, but it's everything which carries meaning. That can be visuals, images, signs, posters, speeches, written words, various genres. And in that way, everything we do and how we relate to other people is in some way by meaning making. We call that semiosis in linguistics, and that means by language. And another very important element of this theory is that language always also implies action. That goes back to the late Wittgenstein. We call that, we have this early Wittgenstein and the late Wittgenstein. So it's more the late Wittgenstein that meaning always is established in context and is context dependent. And that by language, we always also act. And there was a lot of theoretical approaches drawing on Wittgenstein by Austin, Searle, and so forth, the whole speech act theory. So that takes me to power, because if we can act via language, we have certain powers to implement something, to change something, to promise, to order, to command, and so forth. These are all speech acts. And if we now go to the levels of language, there are usually three levels or dimensions of power or doing power. And I must say power is not always bad. Yeah, that is, I think, a very undifferentiated point of view. It depends if it's power by knowledge, by authority, or if it's power just by sort of dictatorial or totalitarian means. So there are big differences of what power actually could imply. And what we're looking at is, on the one hand, power in discourse. So who sets the topics, who sets the themes, who interrupts, who talks more than others, etc. Power over discourse, which kind of topics make it into the public sphere. This is something which is very much related to the media, both social media, but also traditional media. And power of discourse, which means what makes it, what carries on into various other genres, which topics, which arguments might become hegemonic, that means dominant. So we have these power in, power of, and power over. And I think that that is a very sensible way of looking at the way we actually act with and in language.
Would you agree, like you mentioned some of the other theoretical approaches? I myself am familiar with Habermas and Hannah Arendt, and the both of them say that political action is language, basically, that the one doesn't go without the other. Would you think that as well, or what would your be?
Well, I think there, again, it's a dynamic, and the famous language critique, Austrian language critique, Karl Kraus said once in the beginning, or in the 1920s, he said, there would be no weapons without language. What does that mean? That means that language is used to prepare physical violence. But of course, physical violence then does not have to use language. It just is, of course, also meaning making, but there is no accompanying language. Actually, many people say it's because there is no language, people then might use physical violence. But if we look at the steps of action leading to violence, we can see that we need language to prepare that. Yeah, and language is used for persuasive manners and actually to prepare various actions step by step. For example, you mentioned that I studied a lot about racism and also xenophobia, sexism, anti-Semitism, going back very much also to the Frankfurt School. You mentioned Habermas. I specifically also draw on Adorno's authoritarian personality, but also other works by the Frankfurt School. If we look at that, we see that you can prepare exclusion step by step. For example, you can first label people in impolite and offensive ways. Then you can exclude them by legislation. That is already quite a formal way of excluding people from certain public spaces, from certain activities, from certain rights. But it's, of course, again, implemented via legislation, which is also linguistically formulated. Then you can do it by posting things, like if you post a sign that people are not allowed in this bus who are certain ethnic origin or religion or whatever. Yeah. And finally, you can actually exclude them from space totally. Yeah, you can lock them up, and so on and so on, leading, like I mean, the worst case to imprisoning them in concentration camps or murdering them. Gordon Allport, who's a very famous researcher, scholar on prejudice and language, also showed these steps which basically might lead to genocide. So language has a very differentiated role. It legitimates, it prepares, it can appeal, it can support. Yeah, all these various activities are actually implemented via language.
There are so many questions I have already, and I think we just have to try and be general in the beginning, because there's still one general point we have to clarify. But my general question would be, why is it that so many people still think that language doesn't matter? Like, oftentimes you just get the reply, oh, it's just words, why split hairs, it's not important, it's just, or for example, there's this, you'll be familiar with it, like this big discussion on how to name a certain type of sweets, like the Schwedenbomben. I'll not use the other term, but you know what I mean, like just old terms that were okay at one point and now aren't anymore. And I know so many people are like, well, why wouldn't I call that anymore? Like, why do you think people still don't understand the meaning of the significance of language?
Well, I believe that there's a lot of common sense, and we call that folk linguistics. Sort of the common sense which everybody has. Everybody speaks a language. Yeah, their first language, also sometimes called mother tongue or the Muttersprache, but we call it Erstsprache, the language which you first learn at home or with your carers. And basically, because of that, everybody thinks they know everything about language, because all of us use language, obviously. Also sign language, if you, it's also has the same status, is an acknowledged language. And very few people actually are forced or to think about what language then, what effects language has. But if you are part of a minority or discriminated in some ways, like ethnic minorities, religious minorities, sexual minorities, etc., then the way people label these ethnic minorities have a big effect on identity constructions. And obviously language is part and parcel of the construction of one's identity, be it group, community, or individual, because we develop our name, our identity, of course, also by using language. Emotions are also addressed in language or verbalized in language. So if certain names are used which might be offensive, that offends that person or that group. So again, there is an action implied with just the label. So it's not just language or just a name. It has we call that perlocutionary effect of actually offending you, of hurting you, of excluding you, of stigmatizing you, etc. And we know it from totalitarian regimes, and you read the quote by Orwell, and I think Orwell's 1984 is so prophetic, so extraordinary prophetic. It was actually written because of totalitarianism during World War II and afterwards, Nazi regime, Stalinism. But actually, again, it is so prophetic about what is happening right now. And we see that language constructs certain realities. And that labels are used in a very strategic way. And that way, you can really damage somebody's identity by language. So it's not just a label, and it doesn't matter. It matters a lot. And as Jan Werner Müller, a political scientist, wrote recently, said, it's not just identity politics, in a sort of airy-fairy way, sort of only for the elites or something. It's actually about life, And if the Black Lives Matters movement says we don't want to be labeled as X, we want to be called Y, then that means we also don't want to just be killed. So there is a lot of various emotions, but also actions involved in labeling. I must also, though, add a caveat. As with every social movement, there are dichotomies and then exaggerations. And some labels and some concepts matter more than others. So, for example, I don't support rewriting literature from the past because there were maybe non-gender terms. Because that was written in a time where people were not aware of that. And of course, we cannot start now rewriting Sigmund Freud, Nietzsche, Hegel, and the entire philosophy of 2000 years. So in that way, we have to have some kind of hermeneutic approach also to understand what was the time when something was written or said.
Exactly.
So
it's like
that would be my caveat in that respect.
I totally agree. Like language, or specifically texts from old times, are just an important artifacts to know where we came from, how far we've come, and how understand horrid times as well. Like, I mean, for example, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness is controversial, and to good reason. But I think it's still an important book because it makes you see what was happening back then and how we have changed, hopefully for the better. But of course, there are still profound problems. And also, like the close ties with language and identity, you mentioned some examples already. And I think one of the most striking examples to me is that recently I watched an interview with homosexuals from when, like in the 1950s, 60s, they were in their teens. So they're a little old now. And they were asked, what was it like for you to come out? And they were like, well, there was no such thing as coming out. First of all, if somebody knew you were gay, it was a death sentence, or you were stigmatized from the very get-go. Or there wasn't even a term for coming out, for being like, look, I am not heterosexual, I'm not cisgender, I'm something else, which is also normal and okay. And I think this is so striking, to just imagine that you don't even have the words to express who you are and as what you identify, which, as you mentioned, has a profound impact on your sense of identity, and you we tackled that yesterday during the session on mental health, which may then have psychological effects on you, which may lead to mental health struggles and issues, of course.
Yeah, and I think, as I was myself very much included in some of the activities of writing proposals for gendered or gender equality also in language, I think it's very important, and was something we only slowly got aware of in the women's movements in the 1960s, 70s, is that up to then, when one talked about collectives, and they were always in the male form, in German specifically, women were included per se, but they were never visible. And one of our big aims was at that time, and of course that has really changed for many people, was to make everybody who is speaking, everybody's voice visible, i.e. also that of women. Yeah. And in that really changed a lot. And then there were many attacks on us that we were the language police, or that we were regulating too much, or that, I mean, the plural anyway meant both men and women, and so forth and so on. But I think in the meantime, many people have understood that it is very important to make everybody who is actually participating in a conversation visible by name, by their pronouns, depends on the grammar of each language. In German, it's particularly visible, as it is in French, but not so much in English. But in English, we also have he or she, or we have different ways of writing that. And we also saw that this approach to include women into the male had a serious effect, because you talked about that, on health and on medicine, because up to that time, the same kind of diagnosis and the same kind of medication, etc., was used for men and women. And then one slowly found out, actually, women express pain very differently than men. Big linguistic studies about that, very important. And women have to be treated differently than men, and so forth. So suddenly it became obvious also for sociologists and in the medical profession that there are significant differences. And again, it's not just language. It's not just, it doesn't matter. So in many, many ways, one can actually make people aware of the relevance.
I have an interesting question from Hava Yuttagul. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, but I think it fits in very well with what you addressed of language being able, or preparing violence, like with labels and legislation. And his question, or her question, I'm sorry, is if language can prepare violence, what is the antidote to this? More language, less language? How can we redirect language, or how should we go about this?
Well, again, it's not just language, it's also who speaks how, when, and where, and to whom, yeah? And again, you can never see it in a context isolated way. So language can prepare violence if it is spoken by powerful people in a certain powerful position. If, for example, now in Belarus, Lukashenko says, well, we will do something with these demonstrators and so forth, and he has the power both to talk like that, but also to order people to do this. And if you don't have this sort of certain positionings, there are other things you can do, but not specifically what people in such powerful positions can do. But of course, there are counter discourses. And many counter discourses and different uses of language. So there are, on the one hand, ways to use different labels, different arguments, and to have a different narrative, which might confront the sort of narrative of people in power. There are ways of grassroots movements to sort of trigger other discourses and other practices. If we look at Fridays for Future, that is a perfect example right now. A really, really strong global movement, social movement, which suddenly, via certain charismatic people, and you do need sort of people who leadership in a certain way, suddenly found other ways of expressing the necessity of doing something against the climate crisis. Who would have thought that a young Swedish woman still in school would have the opportunity to speak at the UN, to address all heads of states, to be invited to the European Commission, to Davos, to, I don't know which important meeting she was actually not invited to, and to talk in a very different and very emotional way about the concerns and the fears of what will happen to our world. So that for me is a typical counter discourse, a grassroots movement, which was of course furthered by such a charismatic person at the right time, taken up by millions, hundred thousands of young and also older people. And so we have various narratives and discourses always also about the same topic, struggling against each other. And if we are living as we are here in a pluralist democracy, we also have the chance of competing discourses, of conflict resolution, of negotiation, and so forth. Of course, if you live somewhere where that is not possible, it's very, very different. If we look at other sites currently in our world, where there are also grassroots movements struggling to be heard, they are being oppressed. I mentioned Belarus, but you can look at Hong Kong and other locations. Black Lives Matters is, sorry to just say that as because it fits here. Black Lives Matters was of course also such a grassroots movement which started.
Wait a few more minutes until more people have the chance to join us.
I think we have some technical difficulties. Andrea, can you help us out? We're hearing some different audio. Ruth, can you still hear me?
Yes, very well.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
I think it's already over.
What I wanted to say is that Black Lives Matters also started as a grassroots movement and became a global movement. And again, against competing with hegemonic, very powerful, racist and other discourses. And in that way, it really depends who launches it, at what time, where, and if it gains momentum, as it did now with the murder of George Floyd, then it might spread and gain enormous power. The question is if the long-term effect, of such social movement.
And I think that ties in really well with, the topic of social media as such. I mean, to come back to Hannah Arendt, and that I think is really fitting what she said, is that language and conversations are important and take place in the public sphere where people actually have pluralistic opinions. They come together, they exchange their perspectives and thoughts. And she then says, well, things have changed so fundamentally that the public sphere has kind of merged with the private sphere and morphed into the sphere of the social. And this is kind of prophetic as well, because I mean, that would be social media. There is so much being spoken and written on social media, but not everything leads to fruitful political discourse, or, as you said, grassroots movements which actually could make a difference, or should. And there's also, in the context of Black Lives Matter, the big topic of performative activism, meaning that you just repost some things and that's it, and you basically have a clear conscience and move on. Like, there's the question of how long can political movements survive, and social media can play a good or a bad role, to use a binary way of describing it. And so that ties in with the question of, how do you think social media has had an influence on our use of language and language as a political tool, basically? There were many questions in the chat as well, like asking about algorithms and how that can influence that.
Well, I'm not a specialist on algorithms, and I have done no research about that, and I depend on the results which people who are in information sciences about that. But what I can say about social media, because I've studied them a lot, Facebook, Twitter specifically, because if you now study Trump's and Trumpism, you cannot not study tweets. Actually, Kelly McConway, who now stepped back or resigned, said, Trump tweets as everybody else eats. So I think it's really like, you know, he obviously needs that for his survival to eat. But now, jokes aside, what has really changed since Habermas, Arendt, and all these important people have written about the public sphere, private sphere, feminism, and so forth?
Hello, everybody. So
I think
very welcome to the introduction to this 24 hours reading.
We can hear the 24-hour reading.
Joining us here already in the preparations.
Oh God!
I will very briefly read to you a text that one of my colleagues,
I'm going to contact Ben,
who has some background in literature, wrote to introduce you to this book.
Oh, wait a second.
I am a process engineer, so I'm just interested personally in this, but I'm not.
Well, in the meantime, we can read in the chat if you feel like it.
I'm reading, yeah.
But
Ben is fanboard.
Idea of this book, 1984, for a long time.
Oh, we can listen to Orwell being read now.
We would actually like to continue our stuff, right?
Yeah, I know.
For the 24 hours reading.
We're trying to fix it now.
Thanks for joining me here in this introduction session, and hopefully you will also be able to join the discussion and thought exchange afterwards in the fan booth.
Is it over? No, it's not over.
1984, a plan or a warning? One of the most famous utopian novels is probably 1984 by George Orwell,
24-hour reading
along with Fahrenheit 451, written by Ray Bradbury, and A Brave New World by Aldous Huxley.
Das Audio für Ihnen haben.
Orwell describes this dystopian utopia in the book 1984. He imagines,
we have to wait, unfortunately, for them to fix it. I think there's some mix with the audio
which
channels.
In this case consists of 3 totalitarian supercontinents.
All very interesting.
Oceania, Eurasia, and the main action takes place in Oceania, where the party rules.
So I think now we can, do you hear me, Jenny? Do you hear me? Can you speak? Can I hear you? Okay. You can write to me. Okay, we were now talking about the issue of social media, and and the public sphere, and what has happened now since access to social media, especially Twitter, Instagram, and so forth, has become possible, is that everybody now has their public sphere. So we have many public spheres. And that also means that they can be parallel, totally parallel they don't have to overlap, and they don't have to interact with each other. And in that way, something happens, what we know and see right now is that people stay in their echo chambers, don't communicate and interact with other people anymore, and only have the information available which is distributed and disseminated in those echo chambers. And that means that the concept of public sphere as we knew it, Habermas, Arendt, and so forth, has actually vanished, because the public sphere right now in the traditional media, we can use it, but we don't have to use it. And we know that many young people actually don't use traditional media anymore. They don't watch television. They don't use the news channels. If at all, they read online newspapers. But basically, they depend on their echo chambers and the dissemination of information. And that makes, for, on the one hand, for a very pluralistic society, but on the other hand, a society which has almost stopped to interact with each other. And I think that's very dangerous.
I'm back, by the way. Hi.
Good to hear you.
It was weird, but we're back again. That actually ties in with the question on algorithms, because algorithms lead to us being in these echo chambers to a certain degree. I mean, you click on an advertisement or you shop something on the internet and suddenly it's everywhere. You like certain pages, for example, politicians, and it's everywhere. And what's so interesting to me in this regard is that I consciously make the effort of following all kinds of politicians, be it Trump, be it Biden, be it Kurz, be it Kogler, because I want to know all the perspectives. And I've had so many people ask me, "Oh, are you right wing? Like, what's going on?" And I'm like, "No, it's not. It's not my opinion. It's just I want to be informed." And I think it's so fascinating to see how many people think that social media is a portrayal of your thoughts and that it reflects that. And they're so, I feel like, flabbergasted when you burst that bubble.
But it's very, I think that on the one hand, social media have been extraordinarily emancipatory because it has given access to people who had no access to information or very little access. And in that way, we always talk about the Arab Spring, where that became visible. And I had some students when I was visiting professor at Georgetown University in Washington, and there were some students there actively researching the Arab Spring, and it became obvious that only via social media that protest was disseminated. But it was very short term. It had no long-lasting effect. That means if something happens via social media in that way, it has to then be taken up in some way by a community, by a group, organized, etc. Otherwise, such protests or social movements have no long-term effect. The bad thing about that is that it has made many people stop to talk to each other. Both people who are just looking at all these various social media and their smartphones and actually don't see the world anymore, and are just gone, although they are present, they are not present. So you're both offline and online all the time. All of us are offline and online all the time. And I think we have to learn to cope with that in specific ways, because that's overwhelming, and also it's an obstacle to dialogue, to interaction, to argumentation, to deliberation, which are more important than ever right now. And I think that is really dangerous, because we're becoming a sort of non-talking, strange society, sort of, we might even be close to each other, but distant in other ways, So that is an effect. And the third effect is really these parallel discourse worlds, where different narratives and news and conspiracy theories and whatever are exchanged, and there is no way of substantiating, examining, factual evidence, nothing. Yeah. People remain in these chat rooms or in these bubbles, and they think they have the truth, and there are many, many truths out there. Or, as Trump says, fake news, mine is the truth, the other stuff is fake news. And that has changed ways of participating in our societies, and actually has substantiated polarization very strongly, because people think, well, we just don't have to look at each other's stuff anymore. So I think we need to get back to face-to-face communication. In some ways, I'm not against social media at all, yeah, and I use them myself, but we have to develop strategies of how to use them when and where in a sensible way, and still remain polite and talk to people, but also still have dialogues and interaction and deliberation and participation, because otherwise we will lose social cohesion. And I think, as that is in the title of our conversation, I think this is really quite a dystopian perspective.
Yeah, that is very true. Like, also, I had a conversation with a friend of mine recently on that depending on which social media outlet you use, you can influence, well, first of all, the way you transport messages, and also you can either have more or less conversation about that. I mean, on Twitter, there's like, what, a 280 characters limit. Of course, there's no way to really thoroughly address a topic, which plays into the hand of some politicians or others. And also, for example, Instagram, which is, focuses on images, which you also address in your book, that, for example, the political far right makes use of, populists make use of different outlets to address as many different audiences as possible, despite these echo chambers and these bubbles. And I think I just saw an interesting question by Magdalena Obermeier, who's also a Club Alpbach Tirol member. Hi. And this ties in very strongly with the media. I think the question of how far literature and art or other types of, creative outlets may go to sociocritically point out grievances, like what's the line here with memes on the internet and satirical caricatures and that kind of stuff, and political correctness and that connection, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think there, again, this is a different dimension. I mean, fiction and caricature, satire, irony are very important stylistic and linguistic devices. And I think it would be very sad if we wouldn't have them, because we want to have humor, irony, sarcasm. We want to play also with language, because it gives you a certain meta level of giving connotations to what you're saying. And that can be used in different ways, in art and creative art and writing and so forth. It is, I mean, any literature without these devices wouldn't actually be possible. Fiction and writing depends on that. In political language, again, or in political communication, irony, etc., can have very different effects. We did a study recently on irony in meetings of managers, in institutions. And irony is, on the one hand, very useful to open up a space and to sort of laugh about something, and then to come back to a more serious topic. So it opens up, it gives channels, aggressions, and other emotions. On the other hand, powerful people can use irony in very impolite and offensive ways. So I always come back to the statement, it always, and that is sort of the fundamentals of sociolinguistics, is who speaks how to whom, when, where, and with what effect. It can be the same device, very funny and awful. It can be a joke, very funny but extraordinarily harmful for some people. And it always depends on the context. And that is why I think that for literature, for art, all these devices and visual or verbal are extraordinarily important. But if they are transformed and transplanted and recontextualized, as we say, into other spheres of public life, they may become funny, helpful, or really, again, offensive and harmful. So I think what is really important is that everybody should be quite aware of what you do with your language. And that doesn't mean that we're constantly monitoring ourselves. That would be terrible, yeah? And we wouldn't be able to speak anymore. And without censoring ourselves, it would be awful. But we should at least know what language and what can do and what effect it can have. And if we listen to politicians and if we read media or watch media, we should even more be aware of what certain strategies, what kind of effect that could have. So critical language awareness, that's what we call that in sociolinguistics, in applied linguistics, is something which should be taught in schools, to always challenge, to always ask, what is meant by this? When you read important text, as I said, not in everyday conversations, we would all get crazy if we would do that.
I think one striking example of how how do I phrase this? The use of certain language, there is a fine line with satire and cynical use of language. And I think a striking example of how far the effects of that can go would be Charlie Hebdo in 2015, when there were actually attacks against a satirical, paper or magazine because of that. And tying into that, or tying into the meaning of language, and also a question I saw on the chat with regard to if there is a certain language if there are slangs or certain types of languages for certain groups. I think it's a really powerful example to see that minorities, for instance, are reclaiming certain words now, to show that they're more than just these stigmatized words. I mean, in the LGBTQIA+ community would be queer. They now refer, or many of them now refer to themselves as queer, which used or still is to be an insult. Or also with Black people and the N-word, it's just their way of showing this is not who we are anymore. This is our language, and we want to use it to show that's that, you know?
Yeah. Well, that's a very interesting point which you make, sort of choosing the label for yourself. And I think that is something people should respect. It's actually an issue of politeness. If I say I want to be called Ruth, why call me something else? Yeah, doesn't make sense to me. And the other thing is reclaiming negatively connotated concepts. That was very interesting in the in the election campaign for president 2016 between Alexander Van der Bellen and Norbert Hofer, where there was a struggle about the concept of homeland, Heimat. Now, Heimat was actually quite negatively connotated for some people because the Nazis used Heimat very strongly as sort of the German blood and soil which they wanted, yeah, or they believed to have. And in that way, after 1945, that concept was quite controversial for many. And so in the presidential campaign, we actually saw two competing uses of Heimat. We saw an exclusive use by Norbert Hofer from the Austrian Freedom Party, who kind of used that concept as the Christian homeland, excluding people of other religion. and we sort of an exclusive nationalism, and we saw Van der Bellen's inclusive nationalism is sort of Heimat. Austria is for everybody who lives here, no matter, you know, what religion, ethnic origin, etc. And so they both used the same concept, and it was very visible, and we studied that also together with some political scientists. He was very successful in reclaiming and redefining Heimat as a positive concept, as an inclusive concept. And we can actually follow that now as well, sort of these different uses. Who has the right to live here? Who can say this is my country, or who doesn't have the right? Yeah. So these issues of inclusion and exclusion are very strongly debated via pronouns, the we, who is included in the we, who are they, and it's very arbitrary, and political communication makes use of sort of inclusion and exclusion in a very strong sense.
That also is closely connected to this notion of how do you define a nation? Is there even still such a thing as a nation? Like, is there such a thing as a homogeneous entity, so to speak? And I also saw a question on the chat by Li Ting Wang, who asks about how nations should refer to themselves and how states can decide to define themselves, which is, as you just referred to, an incredibly difficult topic, and depends on your framing and on what you want to tie it to. Like in your book, you mentioned that, for example, the notion of Muttersprache, the mother tongue, is often used to exclude other people. Even, for example, if you have immigrants or refugees who just came here and speak German, they are still not conceived as part of this in-group, this us group, because it's not their mother tongue.
Well, I think the homogeneous nation, this imaginary, never existed and will never exist. Yeah. And here I follow Timothy Snyder, who gave a fantastic lecture last year on sort of that this imaginary of the homogeneous nation is really fiction, because there never existed such a homogeneous nation of sort of this people who are all sort of the same ethnicity, language, religion, etc., etc. And sort of it's a imaginary, but there was never this Austria or Germany. There were actually multi-ethnic, pluralistic monarchies and empires, which were much more heterogeneous than our countries right now. The same is true for France, the UK, and etc. I think that we have to go back to the two distinctions in nationalism. There is the distinction of state nations. That means belonging to a country depends on the issue if you have citizenship. So it's a quite clear formal legal definition. And then it depends on how long you were here and this, that, and the other. And then there are different rights and duties, and there can be people who can vote only with residence. And, you know, there are various ways, regimes of how these are defined. But basically, citizenship is the criteria. And sort of then the duration of how long of being here or wherever, and so forth. And then there's the cultural definition. And that is the definition of so-called mother tongue, culture, heritage, and so forth. Yeah. And that is very exclusive, because that means that people who live here as well, and wherever is the here, and who speak different languages and come from different countries and different cultures and so forth, are not included if you have this sort of cultural definition. Usually there is sort of integration of both in various ways. We just finished another book about the transformation of national identities, looking at the Austrian definitions 1995 to 2015, 20 years, and how much that has changed for many people. Mm-hmm. Because, for example, just having access to the European Union has changed our self-definitions. We're not just now a small country in the midst of Europe. We are actually part of the EU, which is another layer of definition for all of us. We are European citizens as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's very important to make this distinction, and that leads to these more inclusive or more exclusive meanings.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I just saw that Li Ting Wang gave an edit of his question, and his question was actually, I was meant to ask, was the issue that some countries are silenced to use their own and preferred name, for instance. Or also what I think of when I read that is that indigenous places were renamed by colonialists, and they are now trying to reclaim or rename these traditional places that hold so much meaning for them. So there is another example of how powerful language and labels can be. But what would your take be on that, like the oppression of an individual?
Well, I think that is a very relevant issue for post-colonial studies, which have been dealing with that. Of course, that links to what I said, that people should have their own voice and be given their voice and their names in their language. Mm-hmm. Again, for certain functions, you might have to use the language of the majority, but for your own self-identification, it's obvious that we need to have our own language. And if our own language is taken away, is oppressed, that is, and we know that from many studies, has terrible and detrimental effects on identities, psychologically or even psychosomatically. Take away your language, take away your identity. And we don't have to go so far to, Aborigines and their obvious legitimate claims. We had language conflicts in Austria for a long time about Slovene and German in Carinthia. Many people will remember the violent fights about city and village names and signs in two languages or not, and what that meant. We had the similar language conflicts in Canada for a long time. Quebecois and English, and we know, again, it's only possible to explain that by knowing what an emotional effect and meaning that has for group identity. Otherwise, we wouldn't understand why do people fight about one or two languages on some kind of sign. Well, it has an enormous meaning. And as we know, the language conflict in Carinthia was only solved a couple of years ago, basically in legislation.
I am so sorry, but we are running out of time, which I could go on with you for hours. It's such a broad topic. I hope that the take-home message for the audience and everyone who tuned in is that language matters, like full stop. There's not more to say. It matters. Think about it. Think about the implications of the use of language. Exactly. There were many questions on the corona pandemic, which unfortunately we cannot elaborate on right now, but I'll post a link or a short thing you can search for on YouTube, because Ruth gave a very interesting short video on the corona pandemic on YouTube for the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue. It's like 7 or 8 minutes long, and there you already have some very interesting input. So if you are interested in checking that out, please do. Other than that, Ruth, it was a pleasure and an honor to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time, and excuse the technical difficulties. We managed to overcome that somehow.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for inviting me and for having such a very interesting conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, Lovely. Me too. Me too. And if you, sorry, I have to plug our club real quick. If you want to follow the Club Alpbach Tirol on social media, we're on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And Ben will probably post my email address in a second. If you have any follow-up questions, maybe we can work something out. Other than that, thank you so much, guys. Thank you, Ruth. And unfortunately, we have to end it here.
Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye.
Take care.